Professor Steven Pinker, thanks for joining me on UpFront. We live in a world in which authoritarianism is on the rise, a world filled with more displaced people than any time since the Second World War, a world on the brink of a nuclear conflict maybe, facing the threat of climate change, and yet you come along with your new, much-discussed book, Enlightenment Now, The Case for Reason, Science, Humanism and Progress, in which you argue that, quote, none of us are as happy as we ought to be, given how amazing our world has become. Amazing how? Amazing why?
Well, any aspect of human well-being that you measure has shown an increase. We live longer, more of us go to school, life is safer, fewer of us die in wars. And the point of the book is not just to document the progress, that's the middle section of the book, and I try to do it in 75 graphs, knowing that people will be incredulous.
There's a lot of data in the book.
They just won't believe it unless they see the graph showing poverty declining, showing deaths in war going down, but also to explain why it happened. I attribute it to a certain set of ideas that were expressed in the second half of the 18th century, the era that we call the Enlightenment, and I identify them as reason. We should try to analyze our situation logically and rationally instead of falling back on tradition and dogma and authority. If we apply reason and science to making people better off, we can gradually succeed. And then I argue that, in fact, we have succeeded.
So we'll talk about whether we've succeeded, and we'll unpack some of your claims about poverty and violence, etc. But your critics say you haven't engaged with the fact that the Enlightenment, the age of Enlightenment, also coincided with the age of slavery, genocide, exploitation, colonialism. There's a lot of downsides that came out of the Enlightenment. There's a dark side to the Enlightenment that you just don't take into account.
Yeah, that's false. I do take it into account. And it's anachronistic. The chronology is wrong. Slavery has existed since civilization has existed. Genocide has existed since civilization has existed.
Given a justification. When Enlightenment philosophers came along and said, well, these people are lesser than us, when people like John Locke and Immanuel Kant were saying outrageous racist things about savages, natives, when people were going abroad to India, Africa, from Britain, from France, to civilize the savages. A lot of scholars say that was associated with Enlightenment values.
First of all, it preceded the Enlightenment. Colonization did not begin in the second half of the 18th century. And also, it was Enlightenment figures for the first time in history that spoke out against imperialism and slavery and colonization. All the great empires that we read about in history, you look at the maps showing the extent of the empires, they got there by conquest. The idea that conquest and colonialism and slavery began in the 19th century is historically wrong, and it was during the Enlightenment that the first arguments against these practices started to carry the day.
But you also did have Enlightenment philosophers like Immanuel Kant saying black people could only be educated to the level of servants, Native Americans couldn't be educated at all. John Locke, the English philosopher, was a supporter of African slavery. David Hume, the Scottish philosopher, said the only civilized nation is the white nation. Voltaire, the French philosopher, was a notorious anti-Semite. You're saying absolutely. There wasn't a dark side to these people who were...
Well, there were absolutely a dark side to these people, and I make the point that this is not a book of enlightenolatry, kind of holding them up as idols. They were flawed. They disagreed with each other. Some of them were slaveholders. Some of them were anti-Semites and racists. What I'm holding up are the ideas that at least the ideas of reason, science, and humanism.
When those ideas are also used by Nazis or totalitarians or colonialists.
Actually, no, they weren't.
There's a lot of scholars who say they were. You don't have to agree with them, but I'm saying there are scholars who say that.
Flat wrong. I mean, the Nazis were proponents of the counter-Enlightenment. They did not believe in universal human flourishing. They believed in the superiority of the tribe.
You're a very prominent scientist, very well-credentialed scientist. Some critics say that your book, though, is less of a reasoned scientific argument, more of a polemic, because it doesn't put forth a hypothesis, test it against the evidence, and then come to a dispassionate conclusion. You start backwards. You have your conclusion, and then you spend around 450 pages trying to find data and graphs, some say cherry-pick data, to justify that conclusion. What do you say to them?
Totally wrong. That's just dead wrong. We all agree on what human well-being consists of, like life expectancy, like death from disease, like death from violent crime. I plot them, and the graphs go in a particular direction.
You plot them by ignoring data that doesn't fit your thesis.
Absolutely false. No,
Well,
which data?
Okay, well, let's talk about it. Let's take global poverty.
Yeah.
You have a chapter in the book on prosperity. You want to make the case that the world is more prosperous and less poor than ever before, and you point to data showing the number of people living on the extreme poverty line, as defined by the World Bank today at $1.90 a day, is down from 2 billion in 1990 to 700 million in 2015. The world is becoming middle class, you say. But surely you know, I know you know, because you're a very clever, well-qualified guy, that there are numerous studies and a number of scholars who dispute that poverty measure as arbitrary, as inaccurate, that in reality, to quote from a recent academic paper by an anthropologist at the LSE, quote, around 4 billion people remain in poverty today, around 2 billion remain hungry, more than ever before in history.
That completely irrelevant to which way the numbers have gone. Of course, the definition of extreme poverty is going to be arbitrary. If you make it higher, then more people will be in poverty. If you make it lower, fewer people.
Exactly.
But no matter what cutoff you set, the direction is downward.
That's not true. That's
Yes,
not, if you look at the work done by Jason Hickel at the LSE, if you take a poverty line of $5, 1 billion people have been added to the number of people on that poverty measure since 1981. The trend shows the exact opposite when you move it to $5 a day.
In terms of the proportion of people in poverty by that criterion?
No, the sheer number of people.
Yes,
1 billion people have been added to the poverty total since 1981.
Yes, but billions of people have been added to the world as a whole. What's relevant is the proportion.
But you also use absolute numbers in your book. You say it's gone down from 2 billion to 700 million.
Well, I note that by at least the most widely accepted definition of extreme poverty, it's interesting that the absolute numbers have declined as well. But the main point is the proportion, because more people have been added, so anything is going to increase.
You say widely accepted, but this is my point. You don't acknowledge in the book, there's no caveats where you say, for example, Professor Lant Pritchett, Harvard colleague of yours, a development economist who studies this stuff, says the poverty line shouldn't be $1.90, it should be $12, $15 a day. And when you make that simple statistical change, the entire picture of poverty changes, and the arguments in your book basically fall apart, do they not?
No, I don't think so. Again, I mean, maybe
statistical change. This is the problem of relying on data. You change the measurement, and everything changes.
Well, no, not everything changes, because I mean, there can be.
Does.
I mean, that's a rather extreme redefinition. That's multiplying by a factor of 6.
He's one of the world's experts on the subject.
Well,
you're
yes,
not.
So,
with respect, this is his field. You could have included the caveats and said, look, there's a bunch of experts who don't agree that poverty is falling. You declare it as fact that poverty is falling. Plenty of development experts disagree with you, is what I'm asking.
Yeah, some do, but if it's a question of just absolute numbers, it's irrelevant. If it's a question of whether we should set the poverty level at $2 or $3, that's irrelevant. Over a wide range of estimates, the picture is the same.
You say irrelevant, but you do realize that if you're a middle-class North American academic and you go to someone living on, say, $1.91 a day and say, well, you're not in extreme poverty, what are you complaining about? We should be grateful about progress. He or she would probably laugh in your face.
Well, but if you compare that person to the situation 20 years ago, if you look at how many people die of hunger, if you look at how many people die of infectious disease, they all point in the same direction toward improvement. And so, yes, I mean, it's always going to be the case that if you cherry pick the people who are worst off, they're not going to be very well off.
You also mentioned inequality, which is a big discussion point right now in the world today. The World Bank, the IMF, the World Economic Forum, even all of these august institutions are saying inequality is a problem, it hurts growth. You have books like The Spirit Level linking rising income inequality to higher rates of homicide, imprisonment, infant mortality, mental illness. And yet you say in the book, economic inequality is not in itself a dimension of human well-being.
That's right, because, well, for one thing, the claims of the Spirit Level have been evaluated and shown to be false.
That's not true. There's
true.
plenty of studies that agree with the Spirit Level. It's not just the Spirit Level.
And there are plenty that have refuted it. The ones with the largest data sets have come to the opposite conclusion, that actually affluence matters a lot more than inequality.
In fact, there are 300 papers published in journals since the mid-1970s linking inequality to ill health, mortality, higher levels of violence. Yes, it's not just the Spirit Level, and some of them cover 120 countries, just for the record.
Right, but inequality is correlated with a lot of other things, with overall level of economic development, with education, with women's rights. So the question is not whether there's a first-order correlation, but whether you can show it to be causal once you take into account all the other factors.
Causation and correlation, as you know, is a real problem. And some say that's a problem with your book because there's a similar issue with Enlightenment. Is it causation or correlation? But just on inequality, you make a sweeping statement in the book. It's jumped out. You said that today the gap between employees and employers isn't the gap it was in the past. They're both likely to be overweight, both likely to wear the same shoes, have similar phones, same TVs, which sounds great, but then you don't mention that in the US today, men who are in the top 1% of income earners live 15 years longer than men in the bottom 1%. A 15-year gap in life expectancy, and you tell us, but don't worry, they have the same shoes and jeans.
Well, I don't say don't worry. I say
the insinuation.
It is not the insinuation. It's let's appreciate the progress that has happened. It doesn't mean that it will never mean that there are no more problems to be solved or that the world is perfect.
But you're saying inequality isn't a problem to solve, and I'm saying if there's a 15-year life expectancy gap, it is, and it should be something that you should place a much higher emphasis on.
Well, life expectancy for everyone is the most obvious criterion for well-being. So we should raise everyone's lifespan.
But right now, in the last 25 years, most of the life expectancy gains, according to Stanford University, have gone to the top 1%.
Yes, but the goal should not be reducing inequality as if we got the top 1% to die earlier, that would be progress. I'm saying that's the wrong criterion for progress.
I think that's a straw man. No one's suggesting.
No, but that's an implication of focusing on inequality as the problem, as opposed to early death that can be prevented. Those are two very different ways of stating the problem.
If you don't recognize the link with inequality, which, to be fair, you don't, although there are other studies that does. Let's talk about another big ig, which you address in the book, climate change. James Hansen, the former NASA scientist, says it could threaten, quote, the fabric of civilization. A big statement. Yet you say, some would say in a rather flippant way in the book, that, quote, despite a half-century of panic, humanity is not on an irrevocable path to ecological suicide. How can you be so confident, given all the overwhelming evidence on the other side?
Well, and there I agree completely with Jim Hansen. He would say the exact same thing, that it's not irrevocable. If it's irrevocable, then it's pointless to try to do anything about it. I'm saying it's not irrevocable, that we should face the challenge and look for solutions, as Jim Hansen does.
But you say is not on an irrevocable path.
But that's exactly what I'm saying. It's not irrevocable if we make certain decisions now.
So what is your solution to the climate change problem, which seems to, on face value, undermine this kind of positive picture you play on the book, given this existential threat we face from climate change?
Too soon to say, because there are pathways to solving the climate crisis. One of them would be carbon pricing, which would mean that every decision that people make factors in the damage to the atmosphere and to the climate. And the other is the development of zero carbon energy sources. And eventually negative carbon energy sources, because we've got to start sucking CO2 out of the atmosphere as well as stopping adding to it.
But you believe those things could work, even though all the people who are involved in the field right now are tearing their hair out saying, none of this is working, the trend is in the wrong direction, things aren't getting better.
The trend is in the wrong direction, but that doesn't mean that nothing could work. Those are two different statements.
I agree, but what's your basis for being optimistic is what I'm wondering about.
I'm not saying I'm not optimistic.
This is a relentlessly optimistic book.
No, it's a realistic book.
You say
that
for what
not
it's worth,
irrevocable.
I think we'll rise to the challenge. Mm-hmm. We can be conditionally optimistic.
Conditionally optimistic, that is,
so
if we take these steps. And if we don't take these steps, then there could be disasters. Yeah.
Okay, so let me ask a balance of probabilities then, since we're trying to nail you down on this subject. It's difficult. Do you believe, as of today, given the situation we find ourselves, the warnings from scientists, the political situation which looks bad, that we're going to be able to solve or beat climate change?
I think the probability is significantly greater than zero. How much greater than zero? I don't know. If it's zero, then let's just drive our SUVs and turn up the air conditioning and not worry about it.
I read a lot of reviews of you. I read a lot of your reviews at New York Times, Boston Globe, Guardian. A lot of the reviewers who read your book said exactly this. Even though they like your style, they praise a lot of the content of the book. They do accuse you of setting up these straw man argument, making sweeping claims. Who's saying zero? Nobody's saying zero. But what?
Well, if you're challenging the idea that we're not on an irrevocable course to disaster.
I'm challenging the idea that anyone can be optimistic about climate change right now, given the political, environmental, economic situation.
Well, as I said,
that doesn't mean it's zero. That means it's bad.
Yeah. Well, it would be bad if we don't do anything about it.
But we're not doing anything about it. You keep adding this caveat, if. We're not. All of the experts say we're not.
Well, we're not doing enough. It's not true that we're not doing anything about it.
Fine. We're not doing enough.
And even some of the worst developments, such as Donald Trump threatening to pull the U.S. out of the Paris Accord, the individual states plan to keep to the restrictions. Other countries, it won't even go into effect until the last month of Trump's presidency, and it could be reversed by a successor.
The US stays in Paris. People are complaining about Paris not being enough.
Well, it isn't enough. No, that is true. Paris is not enough, but it's...
And you're a man who likes experts, expertise, empiricism. You're a famed, brilliant cognitive psychologist. But how does that make you qualified to make these kind of sweeping claims about climate change when you're not a climate scientist yourself, and many of them don't like the fact that you've made these kind of sweeping claims?
Well, because the idea that it's possible that we will solve the climate crisis is not a sweeping claim.
Steven Pinker, thanks so much for joining me on UpFront.
Thanks for having me.